And I'm distinctly honored to introduce our keynote speaker today, Sara Jones, because Sara and I actually met my very first year living in Utah 8 years ago. Sara helped me to coordinate a women's mentorship speed networking event. And being quite new to Utah, to the role, it was really nice to have a partner in crime that could help me to find some other women in the community that could help us do this event. But the interesting part that Sara may not remember, but I remember very distinctly because she was willing to spend some time with me after the event and just kind of chat with me as a new person to Salt Lake about careers and where we were heading, is at the time she said to me, you know, I think there might be something new for me on the horizon. I think I might be thinking of something more entrepreneurial. Well, fast forward, here we are 8 years later, president and CEO of her own company, InclusionPro, and keynote at one of our annual events here at the university. So it was kind of fun. Maybe there was some small, a little memory that I have that helped support Sara's success in this role. InclusionPro is an amazing company. She consults, I'm actually going to read this because I just love the language. Thoughtful leaders on building inclusive cultures with a particular focus on team performance and team innovation. And the reason why I really love that language and what she's done is she's out there doing it. She's consulted with over 80 companies and tech and nonprofits and many different places, and she's out there speaking to leaders about the real hard truths, as you will hear the theme of the presentation in the keynote today. So she's going to say some things that may not be what you've heard at every other event like this, because she's out there and she's seeing what the realities are, what are the challenges, what are the hard truths that we all need to hear if we want to make real change. So with that, I have to say that Sara was honored as Utah Business Magazine's CEO of the Year, a distinguished alumna from our own University of Utah College of Engineering. She got a chemical engineering degree, woohoo, to all the chemies out there. And she was honored with the Utah Innovation Award as well. So Sara also holds a JD from another university that we won't talk about with a different color, but we're still okay with having her here. But without further ado, I would like to please welcome Sara Jones to the podium.
I am thrilled to be here today and really touched by the tone that has been set and the legacy that Edie has. And it is just, I think, for all of us doing this work, something we all aspire to. So I want to thank Dean Ruchi Watson and the Presidential Commission on Women, on the Status of Women, and Dr. Kochenour for making this event possible. And I obviously, as I was walking in the room, I recognized faces of other trailblazers that have been doing this work for a very, very long time as well. So people like you make it possible for us to continue this conversation. As was noted, I started my career in law, and then the second half I did tech startups. Now the one that Ruchi was referring to was a failure. As every entrepreneur knows, you have actually multiple failures before you have successes, and so it was a good learning experience for me. But I did co-found Women Tech Council 13 years ago. Ironically, it was the same year that Edie passed away, and so we get to have that continuity go on. I'm also on Congressman John Curtis's Women Advisory Committee, several company boards. We're going to have microphone issues today, possibly. And I was just appointed to the State Workforce Development Board. So I'm going to start with one caveat. I am not a licensed attorney. So nothing that I say today is legal advice. And most of my experience has been in corporate. And so, I've been in businesses, building industry and communities. And so I've been able to work with thousands of professionals. Because I tend to work with innovators and more in the startup space, I don't tend to feel constrained by the status quo, if that makes sense. In fact, the status quo sort of suffocates me. in a way that is unbearable. And so a lot of my thoughts today are going to focus on inclusive cultures from a place that might seem new. And I know that there are a lot of great leaders that do social justice, policy work, and mental and physical health for women is critically needed. All of that is super important, and it does overlap into our workplaces. But my focus of my work does tend to be in executive and leadership consulting. So the commission encouraged me today to talk about the hard truths. So I am so glad so many of you showed up today, given the topic and that it was completely optional for you to be here. So thank you for spending your time today. And I want to emphasize that my remarks today are in no way a criticism of any of the work that has gone before me. So I'm very aware that decades and decades of work have gotten us to where we are here. I will say that I have been doing this work for about 20 years now, and the way that I think about diversity and inclusion is very different than it was 20 years. And so I'm going to be kind of talking to you about some of the shifts in thinking that I've been going through. And we're actually in a really interesting inflection point now, where we get to make some interesting decisions about where we decide to go from here. So I want to start with some of the data and check in with ourselves on whether we're making progress or not. So I think it's always good to take a look at some of the data. Okay, 40% of our S&P 500 companies have a chief diversity officer or equivalent. Okay? 67% of our universities have a chief diversity officer in the US. 68% of our CEOs say they have a D&I plan. And of our computer science graduates, 19% were women in 2018. That's a national number, by the way. Let's take a look at the harder data. 5% of our CEOs in the S&P 500 are women, compared to 47% of them having a chief diversity officer. 30% of our women, of our university presidents are women. Utah is ahead, right? 50%. That is amazing. 36%, even if they say they have a D&I plan, only 36% tie it to their business strategy of CEOs. And would it surprise some of you to know that in 1985, the percentage of women computer science graduates was 37%, right? Who thought 19% was awesome? Right? It's kind of shocking when you look at the data. Okay, so let's get down to some really hard numbers. We're going to take just a little deeper look. Women in management, we're at 32% in Utah, not bad. The national number is 40%. But statistically, right, if you look at that number statistically, we are not really excelling from a leadership perspective of the percentage of women and CEOs in the state of Utah. Now, ironically, it's the same percentage as in our Fortune 500. So basically you can say it's just as hard to be a woman CEO in Utah as it is to be a CEO in a Fortune 500 company, right? Okay, some pretty significant barriers there. Women board members, publicly traded companies, Utah, women are 12% of board seats. Nationally, it's 20%. So close, still both of them not awesome. I do want to make a note on this 20%, by the way. In 2016 and 2018, there were a total of 230 new board seats available in Fortune 500 companies. Now, I'm going to keep most of my remarks generally to men and women for my talk, but I also want to note that it's important that we also look at, oh, you know, it's when we stand on the court. Okay, I'm going to do this. Thank you. Thank you for, exactly, perfect. Okay, great. Problem solvers in this room. Okay, so it's very important that we always take a look at the intersection of race whenever we're talking about women, men, and all of the other areas of intersectionality. But for today, it's going to be mostly men and women. But I do want to note that there was 230 new board seats available between 2016 and 2018. 124 of them were taken by white women. 32 were taken by black women. 17 were taken by Asian women. And 4 were taken by Hispanic women. So just sit with that for a moment. That's a much longer conversation, but I do want to make sure we are keeping our eyes on some important conversations that need to continue to happen. Again, the topic is hard truths here, right? So you can handle it. All right. This data comes from NCWIT, the Computing Association for Women in Technology. This is the historical graduation data for women in computer science and men in computer science. It's a topic that I care about because my career's been in tech. And I think it's interesting to look at some of the economic influences. I added the dot-com bubble, the subprime crisis to this, and you can start to see the trends of when we start to get new entrants into college. We are at an all-time high for computer science graduates, right? And Utah's experiencing this economic trend. But note, we've never exceeded that 37% historically. And the number of women graduates last year didn't exceed the number in 1985, 12,500 women. Shocking. If we were still at 37% or higher, we would have graduated about 25,000 women in computer science, right? So we still have a ways to go. I'm happy to, the College of Engineering, I called them up and I said, tell me what your data is on engineering. And I'm happy to say, they said over the last 3 years, the number of women in engineering graduates has increased by 33%. So we are moving the needle, but cumulatively, the numbers matter. There's a lot of female talent out there, but we just have to keep checking in on whether or not we're making progress. Okay, so let's get to hard truth number 1. Why? Why is this such a challenge? Hard truth number 1. We are approaching inclusive workplace cultures backwards. And if you've been in this work, you know that some of the stuff that we have to do doesn't always logically make sense. So how do we make it make sense? So I'm going to map it out this way. Most organizations are taking a compliance approach, right? So let's just start with some of the executive level pressure that they are feeling. So consumers now are being much more vocal and active and sort of making votes with their consumer dollars. Think Uber, right? The public is becoming much more active in commenting. Social media creates this amazing platform for people to be able to make note of what's happening within corporations that they don't agree with. So think of the Me Too movement. Employees are becoming much more active. There's things like the Google Manifesto that happened, and they're getting they're more willing to talk about workplace discrimination. So Russell Reynolds did a study in 2017 and 18 of incidents of executive misconduct, and they found there was a $4 billion decline in market capitalization following public exposure of these incidents. Board members, shareholders are becoming much more active. They are expecting executives to get a handle on this. Arjuna Capital, Natasha Lamb there has convinced at least 21 companies to equalize the pay gap. These are well-known companies. Microsoft, Intel, Apple, Amazon, Nike, Starbucks, right? So there's a lot more external pressure happening. Davos, right? Goldman Sachs just announced that they will no longer take companies IPO that do not have at least one diverse board member. So services are now applying peer pressure to executives, and government has always been somewhat active in this conversation, trying to be hands-off, right? Affirmative action was not well received. So pressure creates fear. Fear creates compliance, risk management, legal, HR, PR. Fear dehumanizes and disconnects people. It keeps people from engaging authentically. Fear is an external motivator, not an internal motivator. Then the next phenomena you see happening is clustering within organizations. Employees start to form groups and organize and become and form like-minded groups. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. They see other companies do it and they think, oh, we should do that too, right? Or they are not supported by their organization. Now, if you're an executive and you get wind that your employees want to form groups because they don't feel trust, that is an executive level conversation to be had. Employee groups will typically attract minority populations in the company, right? But then you start to see some interesting things happen. And usually these are grassroots organizations that are not well supported and funded by leadership. But ironically, the leaders will put these leaders up on a pedestal. Aren't these people amazing? Look at what they're doing. Sometimes these groups can cause territorialism within organizations, polarizing activism, and misguided uses of the energies of this group. And then the other phenomena you see in a compliance approach is delegating. So this is where an executive team says a D&I plan is needed, HR, you handle it. Or let's hire a chief diversity officer. So this can be in response to this external peer pressure that I was talking about. It could be an attempt to create an impression of fairness, but a lot of these attempts set these chief diversity officers up to fail. The initial thing that happens is a misalignment between what the leadership team thinks they want, that's what's in the job description, and then what really needs to happen, right? The chief diversity officer comes in and says, whoa, this was not what I expected. There's a lot of work to be done here. What's also happening is a lot of people are going into diversity roles new to this. So it's a little bit similar to product management, how that role started to form years ago. As we started to see the need for product managers, people would fall into that role from some other area of their company, not necessarily trained to do that, but certainly capable of doing it, right? So we have a lot of new people that are senior in their organization that are taking on these roles, and they're finding that it's too much to take on, right? Toxic workplace culture, managing the employee resource groups, recruiting, retention, plus other corporate responsibilities. And if it's not connected to the business priorities, it becomes even harder because they get the lack of support from executives. So they tend to not have the power they need to make the difference within their organization. What sometimes happens is the chief diversity officer is in this role of being the scapegoat, and nobody likes being in that role, right? They have a hard time justifying their value because often they're seen as a cost center, not a value center, not a revenue creator, right? Sometimes companies will say, well, we can totally justify the cost because it's way less than, having to manage a bad PR case, and sure, that makes sense. But when we get real about what our chief diversity officers are facing, it's no wonder that the chief diversity officer is a very high turnover role. So to summarize, the compliance approach is characterized by this. Leaders who are externally motivated, they're reactive to external forces, and it takes a very courageous leader to overcome complacency. There's few people that care, and it's usually the ones that are not represented by the dominant diversity characteristics. And lastly, companies tend to turn to a single focal point, like a chief diversity officer or the HR team, to be in charge of D&I initiatives, which means they get low priority from the organization. So what does an inclusive approach look like? Now that we just had that big downer, right? Thank you for laughing. We'll sprinkle some jokes throughout. Okay, so it's called the inclusive approach. Aligning is a critical component. This is where the D&I focus becomes a business priority. Even though 68% of executives say they have a D&I plan, only 36% of executives say it's actually part of their business strategy. So there's a lot of work to be done around organizational alignment, shared responsibility, building capacity and knowledge across the entire leadership team. And these alignment to core diversity inclusion drivers and being tied to business and funding, and that funding allocation and staff allocation should actually all happen before you decide to hire a diversity and inclusion executive. So this is where bringing in outside consulting can be incredibly helpful. Now, oftentimes what happens is leadership teams try to do this with a lot of false starts because they don't know what they don't know. In their history, they've seen someone take a D&I plan as a side project, not core to business. So they think to themselves, it's easy. And I actually tell executive teams D&I work is the hardest because it is both an intellectual, strategic approach and very emotionally challenging. So you are combining the heart and mind in a way that other executives are not having to do. And that's why it is such a challenge. Bringing in a strategic consultant that can help align them right in the first place can be very helpful. Next, excuse me, I'm wondering if I could just get some water. Okay, awesome, thanks, Ruchi. Building. Then you go into the building phase, engaging all the leaders in your organization around exhibiting the behaviors around diversity and inclusion and fostering these initiatives. This makes sure that all leaders across the organization are clear with their responsibilities before you ever hire a chief diversity executive. This also allows you to hire a chief diversity executive at this stage. So notice this is a stage earlier than the other stage, because now you can bring in an executive earlier in the planning process and allow them to help partner and build these programs and not have to fix a bunch of mistakes. So this also allows you to be, and hopefully you will be, transparent with the organizational needs early on. And you want to make sure that this person has strong ties to the executive team. If not part of your executive team, regular interaction with the executive team. They have to be able to, thank you very much, they have to be able to question your executive team and challenge them on current practices. If they're not in a position to do that, it's not going to be effective. All right, then you get to scaling. This is a stage where your ERGs, your community programs, and all of your recruiting D&I programs are fully empowered and funded. Your entire leadership team is activated to support where they're needed. The Chief Diversity Officer has all of the resources they need, access to data, influence to change behavior. They can effectively communicate both internally and externally, and they can be the disruptor when they need to be and challenge the status quo. So this is characterized by integrated leadership who practice inclusion. The, They tie inclusion to company business strategy, and they can have authentic conversations with each other. Organizational allyship, where all stakeholders are engaged in meaningful, inclusive practices. They are well supporting the ERGs and all of your other inclusion programs, and all of your programs have support from leadership. And if you notice, now you have an entire activated community within your organization that employees and partners who can contribute, and who the Chief Diversity Officer or your HR leaders can activate and call upon to support all the efforts. It looks and feels very different, right, than the compliance approach. So what do we need to make this approach happen? Let's get to hard truth number 2. It's time to include men. I put white men here, just kind of noting the state of our state, where we are currently 79%. 79% white. I do want to note, however, that the white, when we say white, that includes a lot of ethnic categories, such as Middle Eastern, North African, and so I do want to note that white is actually very broad, but we also note that there's a lot of classically European white people in Utah that have a lot of decision-making power here. Okay, so The compliance approach has this effect on men. And so let's just take a moment to kind of categorize what are they feeling and experiencing during this. So again, pressuring, clustering, delegating that causes these effects. What does it feel like to be that man? All right. You can feel at the externally motivated level reactive to external forces and guarded. Am I the villain or am I the savior? Right? Can't be either or, and that can change depending on who I'm talking to. Few people care can feel like this. I'm unengaged. I don't identify with those groups that have formed within the organization, or I'm disconnected. It doesn't affect me. Single focal point results in being siloed. That's not my job. There's someone here to take care of it. And complacent. It's a low priority for me, and you tend to get less support from me. So we have historically built our diversity and inclusion programs backwards because of the lack of support for men. And I'm not saying they've intentionally held themselves back, but these cultures tend to drive less support from men. For those who've been doing this work for a long, long time, there has been real resistance in the past. So not only were we doing it on top of our day jobs, but trying to get support from men felt a little bit like going into the lion's den. Sometimes you would be met with comments like, "This is your issue, not mine," or "Why do you always play the women's card?" Right? So it makes it really challenging to make change. For the younger generations that are in the room, so glad you're here. You're entering a workforce with a lot more opportunities for flexibility, paid leave, and more understanding leadership, and so you're welcome. And you can thank the hundreds and thousands of women that have made the workplace better for everyone, for both men and women. But you can see how the lines have been drawn between men and women during decades of a compliance-driven approach, where changes only happened on a need-to basis rather than a want-to basis. And because they've been outside of these critical conversations of diversity, we've actually lost decades where men could have been part of this conversation. And now it's 2020, and we're expecting them to be fully versant, right, in this area where they haven't been highly involved. So we have a dilemma here. So it's a time to be inclusive of men. Why? Well, because 95% of our CEOs in the state are men, 88% of board members are men, 79% of people working in tech are men. Statistically, you can actually have a bigger impact if you can influence that population. When we overly focus on diversity, we sometimes send a message that we are against men, that they are in fact not diverse. So sometimes when they hear the word diversity, it makes them feel like it's an us against mindset. The truth is, men are still part of the diverse world that we live in. Inclusion means that all voices matter. Now, this does not mean that men dominate the conversation, but it does mean that they have experiences that we can understand. Empathy leads to understanding, which leads to productivity. So I want to talk about 4 things we can do to better invite and include men. First, to men. When you are invited to join these conversations, please don't opt out. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, right? You're all opting in, thank you. But oftentimes, those invitations get sent to the woman or the person of color in the organization. It certainly couldn't have been intended for them to attend. And make the choice, if you're a man, to opt in and do the thing that we so often tell women. Lean in, right, to the opportunity to engage in an inclusive conversation. Second, it's up to us to create safe learning spaces. So remembering that a lot of men have not had the learning opportunity that women have been engaging in for decades. Establish a tone of respect, foster dialogue, and remove the expectation of perfection. Encourage youthful curiosity to learn about others' experiences. Even hire an experienced facilitator if you need to help with these conversations. Third, if everyone is all in on these conversations, actively listening and participating, we show a positive intent to create the right working relationships. The performance benefits come from engaging authentically with one another. Fourth, honor everyone's journey. When you listen to men's experiences, you can gain a greater appreciation for how they're struggling with how rapidly social dynamics are changing. We're all adapting to a new world of diversity in the workplace and more equitable flow of opportunity. I chose those words very carefully. Equitable flow of opportunity looks very different than it used to. And so that can challenge some men who are not used to seeing an equitable flow of opportunity. It looks like this. Men can feel worried about their livelihoods, about saying the right thing to women and people of color. They can be worried about the perception that preference is being given to others. Let them share these concerns with you. Show them empathy and assure them that we're all in this together. It's obvious, but men are humans too. They sometimes feel frustrated with the box that we put them in, right? To be tough, manly, and stoic. They actually want other options as well. And we can invite them to the table as full humans, and you will see that they are actually quite diverse as a group. So, why is a woman who's a racial minority up here defending men? Well, because it's obvious, men are people. They're also my friends, my colleagues, they're in my family, and men have been told for a long time to be allies for women. And we have this choice now to choose to be allies to them. Now, I've actually been doing this for most of my career. So even though I sort of position this as a new thing, it might surprise you that when we first started Women Tech Council, we took a critical look at how the work was being done. And we decided to do it differently 13 years ago. We actually structured it so men were 30% of our advisor board from the very beginning, and they've always been part of our advisor board. So this concept for me personally is nothing new, but we haven't necessarily scaled this idea in the workplace. For some of you in the audience, being an ally to men may sound strange. It may sound like I'm not understanding the nature of privilege. For years, we've been using the term ally to encourage men to side or support women. It was a very one-sided view of allyship behavior. And in some ways, this continues to reinforce aspects of male privilege. However, an equally valid definition of allyship is to combine or unite a resource for mutual benefit. When we look at our interactions between men and women from a place of mutual value and benefit, it completely changes the narrative. Now, instead of men feeling like they walk this tightrope of savior or villain by you're either an ally or you're not, we expand the range of behaviors that we can engage in. We can now free them up from seeing women as needing their help to a source of actual intellectual and economic value. I know the shift of language is very subtle. When people are trying to be an ally to women, they often come at it with good intentions. But sometimes their allyship is less productive than they think it is. And it's hard if you're on the receiving end of someone's good intentions. So let me just illustrate this with an example. I think this will clear it up. Okay, and I'm gonna just take a water break. Just so you know, I'm used to my keynotes being a lot shorter. But I'm excited about the opportunity to actually explain what I'm talking about. Okay. So a real life example, Jennifer is a startup founder. She has a busy personal life. So basically she's like no different than any other tech founder in Utah, right? And we tend to have children at younger ages, that's common. But only 2% of venture funding goes to women founders. Now you as a male ally may want to support her. So you think, oh, I know another woman in tech, her name is, okay, stop right there. Okay? Do you see where this line of thinking is going? but this happens all the time. People love to connect women based on their gender, even if it is not helpful in their immediate pressing concern. The other woman in tech is only helpful to Jennifer if she is a startup founder who has succeeded in fundraising. What is really going to push Jennifer's startup dreams forward? It's simple: getting an investor check. If it was a male founder, you would never think, oh, I really need to introduce you and meet another man in tech, right? You would simply connect him to investor opportunities. So an ally would do the same thing he would for a man. He would make introduction to Jennifer to great investors. And by that, I mean investors who do not waste her time and allow her gender to be a barrier to getting that check. Sometimes we think we are being awesome, but we are really being less awesome. So being an awesome ally is helping women get faster to their goals, not making extra work for them. Did you know that women founders tend to take 5 to 10 times as many investor pitch meetings as male founders? That's time away from building their business. By the way, that's time away from building their business. So you're actually doing her a favor if you can send her to a great investor who will treat her fair and not waste her time. And by the way, the investor also benefits. You're not doing Jennifer a favor. The investor benefits by getting great deal flow of great startup founders. It is not one-sided. So do you see this subtle shift in thinking when we truly see each other as valuable allies? And by the way, you can ask Jennifer to give you valuable introductions as well. Okay, so the inclusive approach, what is it characterized by? Okay, it's characterized by integrated leadership. This is what it feels like. Strategic, a leadership team that is strategic and intentional and authentic. Organizational allyship is characterized by departments and stakeholders who are partnered around inclusion, and they productively reap the benefits of innovation and creativity, higher productivity. An entirely activated community who is connected across the organization around values of inclusion and belonging, and they are energized by diversity of thought. That's an organization I want to work for, right? It just feels so different. So notice the inclusive approach is a much more human-centric approach, even though its roots are highly strategic and highly intentional. Notice that men benefit as well, being included at every stage, feeling relevant to the conversation rather than being maneuvered around or only brought in when there's a crisis. Now, the really big win is that you will be building a culture that millennials and Gen Z value. So I want to give you a quick snapshot of the cultures that they value. Connection and authenticity. Organic diversity. So notice, they actually don't hyper-focus on diversity. Their world is much more diverse, naturally. So they don't really connect with this idea of hyper-focusing on diversity. They're open about real issues. And they want their focus to be on their potential, not on their skin. Okay? So notice the organization that I just described is able to accomplish this. Well, this all sounds great, but how do we get there? Including men requires shifts of thinking at the highest levels of the organization. And this may be new to many executive men. But the good news is that there are a lot of men that are trying, and they will welcome an invitation to be part of an inclusive organization. The most powerful leading indicator that your company will succeed at inclusion is the percentage of white men who are practicing inclusive leadership. We measure a lot of things in this D&I space, right? But if you could boil it down to one key measurement, I think this is it. When your leadership team is on board, this important data point can actually be added right into your objectives and key results, also called OKRs for executives, which as a critical accountability measure. This can also be measured at every level of the organization, and you will be fascinated to see how this measurement correlates with all of the other things that we are measuring: retention, engagement, promotion rates, risk management claims, EEOC claims. Okay, last hard truth. Compliance is easier than building trust. We all know that transformational change is not easy. It requires intention and commitment to reset organizational values with a clear focus. So just saying diversity and inclusion is a priority is obviously not enough. We have to teach a brand new set of behaviors that neither diversity by itself or inclusion by itself accomplishes. We need a blend of both. We must first be clear, though, about the difference between diversity and inclusion. So when we all understand what this difference is and the difference of the definitions, we can start to shift our mindsets to what inclusive leadership really is. So let's just do a quick tutorial just for frame of reference here. Diversity is the art of identifying characteristics in people. So I can look around this room, which I obviously did. I was delighted to see a mixed audience here today. Also mixed ages, which is awesome to see. But I want to point out one truth here, which is that does not mean that we as a group are inclusive, right? We're just a group of interesting people that are sitting together in a room. Okay, so what is inclusion? Inclusion is the art of engaging people. And an important truth here is that inclusion is easier between like-minded people. So because I come from an engineering and law background, I like to kind of put this in an analytical framework for people who are more analytical. Inclusion and diversity are different behaviors. We put them on different axes. They're not the same thing. They go from low to high on both axes. And you can measure low performance to high performance. Now on the left side of the screen, if you see a performance line that looks like this, on the left side you'll notice that you can actually have a company with low diversity but high performance. Happens all the time in Utah, right? So then you start to diversify your team and you go through a performance dip. So inclusion actually gets harder before it gets easier. And then the data shows us that you can come out on the other end as you have higher diversity with higher performance, which is what we all strive to do. So this line is the compliance cycle, and it's often riddled with things called like the tokenized minority effect. And when I'm working with executive teams, I point this out because oftentimes they're like, there's this big of a performance dip. I said, yeah, but you might not be feeling it. Who's feeling it, right? The new person or the person who is having to both prove themselves and work twice as hard, right? That kind of impression of I've got to prove myself because I'm the first woman, I'm the first LGBTQ person to join this company. I'm the first, second, or third, or whatever number until we can overcome that tokenized minority effect. So sometimes this comes as a surprise to executives, even though, you know, I was that person, not a surprise to me. So we can overcome this performance dip if we are very intentional as a team. And this is the inclusive leadership cycle. This is the path that we were talking about and characterizing earlier. But it requires a shift in behaviors. So, sorry, I know somebody's trying to take a snapshot, but so we still need inclusion and diversity to happen within our organizations. And the way I describe it is if you just focus on inclusion or hyper-focus on inclusion, you tend to work with like-minded people. This actually happens with people of color, LGBTQ, right? It is not a phenomenon of just white men. Hyper-inclusion tends to people gravitate toward like-mindedness. Now, if you just focus on diversity, you tend to focus on identifying characteristics in people. This is more of a like affirmative action perspective. And now I'm really actually more focusing on your race, your gender, your whatever characteristic. And I don't know about you, but really when I'm at work, I just want to get work done. I just don't really want you to focus on my gender and race. So we've got to have something new happen. It's like taking red and purple on the screen and creating a new thing, purple, leading with inclusion and valuing diversity. So this is the new definition of inclusive leadership, but it is a new set of behaviors. There's a lot that goes into teaching a team to shift to this mindset of leading with inclusion and valuing diversity, and we unfortunately don't have enough time here to go into it. This is a long process to get your executive team and leadership team aligned with this, what this new behavior looks like. And what's really cool is if they do it right, it can be integrated within your value set. So you actually don't have to say diversity. You don't have to say inclusion. You're actually describing behaviors that you want everyone to comply with, or not comply. We're trying to stay away from compliance. Yes, thank you. And then what happens is diversity organically happens, right? So it's super cool to see when this happens. So it does require a new shift, but I do want to leave you with something simple that you can take away, where you can start to get people down towards this inclusive leadership path. So I am a big believer that empathy and understanding lead to higher productivity. And for some people, this is actually a shift in behaviors. So I'm going to use another scenario to illustrate this last point of how you might, given that your organization might not be completely there yet, how do you apply empathy and understanding and collaboration? And I'm going to use it with a scenario that comes up a lot. And it's not always a super visible scenario, but we know it happens. So it's a leadership example, and I'm going to have you envision that you're the CEO right now, and this is a member of your executive team. His name is James. James is a sales leader. He is confused by all of the new diversity programs that are being rolled out by your company. You know, groups for women and LGBTQ, veterans, ethnic minorities. He doesn't identify with any of these categories. So he wonders, gosh, you know, I respect the CEO, but why are you investing so much in what's a minority of our company population? That's a big investment. And so he comes to you privately as the CEO, and he says, you know, I kind of feel like you want me to only hire women and minorities. You know, I feel like you're like tying my hands behind my back. So your natural reaction to this type of comment might be emotional, right? You might say, huh, really? But this conversation happens all the time, and it happens behind closed doors in these private settings. And this is the kind of conversations that CEOs are having to deal with, this perspective that happens a lot. Now, it's not so hard to understand where James is actually coming from, right? We just talked about this change that is happening, and that for many people, they're unfamiliar with this change. And you as the CEO can probably remember a time when something changed on you, you didn't ask for it, and that made you uncomfortable, scared, afraid, uncertain, right? So hopefully you can call back to those times and just remember that things are changing for men at a very rapid pace. And we can get better collaboration. So that's the empathy part. We can get better collaboration when we can understand each other's perspectives. If James didn't have the trust to talk to you about how he's feeling so you can understand his perspective, then it's really hard to have a productive conversation with him. Now notice, you as the CEO, you might respond like this. James, it was, you know, really glad you came and talked to me about this. I understand that the company shift might feel uncomfortable. I'm really glad that you trust me to share that with me. I just want you to know that I'm also learning too, right? Because most of these CEOs are going to be men. I'm also learning too. Also, women CEOs need to learn. And so you're not alone in this, right? And of course, we're going to continue to hire men, but hopefully you can agree that we can do better at hiring in all areas. And hopefully you'll support me as our company makes the shift to be more competitive on talent. So notice you can get better collaboration when you empathize and you understand. And notice that you actually don't have to give up anything if you're the CEO. You don't have to give up anything on your commitment to diversity and inclusion by understanding if you take the time to create that human connection with James. You can respond in a way that doesn't create disconnection or hostility, and you show human connection by showing willingness to learn alongside your leaders. I believe there is room for empathy and understanding as we shift to this inclusive world. So thank you today for being willing to face these hard truths with me today. I am looking forward to a deeper dive. I'm sure your minds are just spinning right now, getting excited for the next panel. Thank you so much for your time today.